Good morning. Today in our lives, we have many, many difficult conversations, and we have very tragic world events. Many of us at times feel immobilized and hard to have meaningful discussions with others who disagree with us. Not only COVID, but woke and fiercely held perspectives keep us from working towards loving and peaceable relationships with neighbors, with friends, with family, with other associates, let alone working for peace in our region, our province, our country, our world. Is isolation growing? And are we keeping to our own tribe or our close associates, biblically, theologically, in order to be defensive of our own selves in these days? This sermon comes out of texts I was given by Breslau Mennonite, where I'm preaching next Sunday. So you're my congregation, and I'm testing it out on you. This was one of the hardest sermons that I've had to work with, and it was helpful to know that John Paul Lederach, also used a text of Esau and Jacob as a focus for bringing people together and doing conflict regulation and conflict resolution. So my main focus is going to be on Esau and Isaac, but I gave those other two readings because I think a basis is what are in those readings. We are told over and over again, love, 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 care for. If you don't love, you're missing the point. So, what does it mean? How are we relating to our neighbors whom we're commanded to love? In fact, Jesus and others open the neighbor to all human beings in the world. And we know these texts that call us to love our neighbor, but I think there's something underneath it that we need to examine. Thursday morning, a Haudenosaunee panelist at the Glebe breakfast said, "In our teachings," meaning Abashoni teachings, "hate is a choice." He emphasized being one with all creation and not hating. So do you believe that there is a choice to love or to hate? Is it an easy choice for you, or is it an automatic choice? The initial anger of Esau, and I'll sort of tell the story as we go along. The initial anger of Esau when he lost the birthright and Isaac could not give him more birthright may be natural and an appropriate emotion. Continuing the anger and turning it to hate and resentment, even threatening Jacob, was that also a choice or not? The choice can be difficult because Leviticus commands us not to hate others, including neighbors. And 1 John 4 basically tells us that if we don't love our neighbor, we don't love God. There's even a sort of a rant about that, which is sort of an interesting one. So how do we work through the conflicts and the tensions in our world without choosing to hate, when others are choosing to hate? And how do we live without resentments in the midst of what's going on in our world, especially when there's so much fear and so much quietness where people just don't speak? Or is there a way to love? What are we choosing? This month, we are aware, frustrated, and even distraught by the war in Israel and Palestine. It occupies a large place in our news. But can we even talk about this conflict? We have our past experiences with Jews and Israeli government and Muslims and Palestinians and Mennonite Central Committee and our reading of the Bible and our hearing of news from various contexts. We know, many of us, I should say not all, but many of us know people in Israel and in Palestine who are directly impacted by what's going on there? And are we pressed into conformity or silence by active proponents from one or the other side so that we don't speak? I was totally frustrated that the Palestinian issues were never mentioned, or rarely mentioned over the first couple of days of the conflict in Israel-Palestine. I am against all killing, and I'm not supportive of the Hamas raid. And yet the bombing and the retaliation of the Israeli government was equally upsetting and totally grotesque. And media seem to primarily repeat that Israel's government has a position to protect all of the people in Israel and defend themselves. Thankfully, more has come out gradually, very gradually, about the Palestinians and their long-term suffering, and even Palestinians in the West Bank who are being bombed. It's grotesque what's happening. War is always grotesque, and unfortunately or fortunately, we're now seeing it in the media. This is only one example of the polarization in our world. Some politicians push forward with blaming other politicians for specific actions when the issues are far more complex. Simplistic seems to be a way a lot of people want to handle what happens in the world, and simplistic in terms of what I think and how I want the world to be. Politicians, among others, are using wedge issues to gain voters. In the U.S., we have Trump and others who are bullying many into submission. Woke groups push people in one direction with their perspective, and then there are issues where we get pushed in other directions around all kinds of issues. I just immediately think of LGBTQ+ or environment or indigenous populations, and we're often struggling with how to respond. Can I respond? What happens if I do respond? So why do we not speak out and frame our response in ways that guide our conversations and actions toward the positive and toward understanding each other? How can we build community if we cannot talk civilly with one another? And how can love start to predominate if we can't even speak civilly? Can we disagree without using hostile language or needing to convert the other person? Why do people need to convert me? I don't know. How do we prepare ourselves to accept and understand and walk with others who are different than we are? Esau and Jacob, and sort of frame the story, are twins, and Esau comes out first. He's firstborn. And there was conflict in the family. Isaac preferred Esau because he seemed to have more masculine characteristics and he was a hunter. And Rebekah preferred Jacob because he could cook and he was around and he had more traits that were appealing to Rebekah. Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he was the chief rabbi in Britain. He has written a helpful book on the Abrahamic families and the book of Genesis. And he cited how dysfunctional every relationship was when you go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and go on through the whole narrative of Genesis. Every single one of those families is horribly dysfunctional. Abraham gives Sarah as a concubine to a powerful leader. Jacob and his family have multiple problems. Joseph is sent to Egypt to be a slave. You know those stories. And now here's Jacob, who fears his brother. Esau is viciously angry, and his father has been tricked. And somehow his father can't give past the fact that there's only one birthright. So the two brothers go apart from each other. It's interesting that somehow they kept in touch with each other or were aware of where the other was. How have we been set up by our backgrounds, through our families, our education, our culture, and our experiences? We assumed that it was better to be a cowboy than an Indian. I'm basically speaking to the young men among us. Now that's even an inappropriate term. We had lots of cowboys and no Indians when we decided to choose up. And I remember seeing comics on television which portrayed people who looked very Arabic, and they were always the villains. I learned the history of the United States and how its greatness and its democracy and its peacemaking and its human dignity. And I think a lot of that's become unraveled as we hear of that our heroes had some really dark sides to them. Our education was very selectively presented. Are we guilty of these barriers into our being able to love and care for others appropriately? I would suggest that guilt, what I call a gift that keeps on giving, is counterproductive and doesn't help us to actually engage fully in relationships with other people, and it stymies us. Guilt is appropriate for my actions where I harm or offend another person, and I need to deal with that. But in the issues that we're facing currently, many of those issues, we need to reflect on what's happened and what we have learned, and how can we change our thinking and practices from things we've learned that weren't exactly the way we could have created the world as a better place. To choose love is not simple in conflict situations. We have not chosen our place in history and culture. We landed here. Raina Neufeld examines Manitoba Mennonites as they settled into Manitoba. She quotes Michael Rothberg, who talks of white settlers as being implicated subjects. I think that's an interesting term. Implicated subjects occupy positions assigned to them with the power and privilege without being themselves agents of the harm. What we got, we weren't agents of what we got. We got it, and we were there. They contribute to inherit, and benefit from the regimes of dominance, but do not originate or control such regimes. Jacob and Esau are favored by their parents. We would speak of a dysfunctional family, as I have. Somehow messages got to Jacob about the problem of not being the firstborn. So he offers Esau a bowl of soup when Esau is hungry. And Esau is not thinking about birthrights, and so he gives them off to Jacob without any thought. Birthrights are particularly important in many countries and societies. The oldest son often inherits vast amounts of the family prestige and money, and the land in some cultures also is responsible to the parents and the others around them to keep up the ethos and the economy. But then others in the family, sons and daughters, or mainly sons, have very little, if anything. A significant part of the story, this story of Jacob and Esau, is Jacob preparing to meet Esau after many years, when both of them are wealthy. Jacob is afraid. Even though he arranged the meeting, he's afraid to meet Esau and what Esau could do to him. Jacob needs to wrestle with what he has been taught, with what he has done to steal Esau's birthright, and all the other factors that caused the conflict between the two brothers. Jacob should have some guilt because of some of the things he did, but his actions were under the influence of his mother, Rebekah, as well as some of the family tradition. For each of us to destroy hate and continue to a loving and understand relationship with others, we too need to examine what has happened to us, what we have learned, and what distances us from other people. We need our times to wrestle with the angel or God or another person, however it is, or just myself. How did we develop our attitudes, our practices, our fears, our stereotypes? How can we be more open and considerate of the other person? How can we listen? Are we able to listen to hear the other person tell their story. What is important in this conversation and our work together, and how does the other person see it, and how do I see it? Not one imposing on the other. 10 days ago, an Orthodox Jewish man who's part of the Y, and we see each other in the locker rooms as we're finishing off. And I cannot remember how the conversation began, but he stated that his niece had managed to get on a plane and escape Israel. She had been in Tel Aviv, and she managed to get out. And he and his family were so thankful. And I said, I'm thankful too. There's no one who needs to be killed. I don't like killing, and I'm glad she's safe. Now, if he and I got deeper into the conversation, it would be very difficult for both of us. We've talked before, and I know he supports the Israeli government and follows the news, especially the Jewish news. And I'm aware of how much I follow the Palestinian news and how I'm aware of what's happening in Gaza, and especially even more in the West Bank because of where I've been. And I remember way back, even when I was over there, I remember way back the Lutheran bishop had received a Christmas or a hamper, a Christmas bundle that MCC did. Both of us were kids back in like 48, 50, 52, when we were taking Christmas bundles over to Palestine so that people there would have the clothes they need, the toothpaste, everything else. I've also read Pape's history of Israel and Palestine. He's one of the first historians to put the two histories together. Otherwise, there were two histories. But he got forced to leave the Haifa University, and he has to live away from Israel. We have had significant issues at Interfaith Grand River, and the Israel-Palestine issue is one that we have a hard time talking about because we have Jews and Muslims in the room. We have people who sympathize, and Christians as well, sympathize with Palestinians, and others are very sympathetic to the Israeli cause. We have good reasons to stay in our own cocoons. But is that a way of choosing love? How do we love each other in the midst of significant differences? Jacob can be an escape for us. He faces his fears and struggles with them. Perhaps he looks at the forces which led him to feed Esau the soup. Does he look at that? Does he look at what his mother was doing with him? Does he look around the struggle of his mother and father? Does he struggle with what it means to be a brother? Now both have sufficient wealth. How does he look at all the forces that have caused the split between he and Esau? When one expands this to the conflict in our own communities, and the conflict is here, 44 years ago or 43 years ago when we arrived, only 2% of the people in Waterloo region were significantly different than what they are now. And now we're at 26 to 30% somewhere of people who are recognizably different. So it's an issue for all of us. We have to face who's out there with us. How can I be humble? Can I listen? Can I accept the other person or group as they are? Or do I start to think that I need to change them because I am better or I know more or whatever? Do I understand the history of our differences? For example, do I know about the doctrine of discovery and how it pushed forward white, European, and Christian superiority? How did we become people who saw other humans as less than we are? What's going on? Can I learn more? And can I let the other be my teacher? What does it mean theologically that all humans are created in the image of God? That God loves all people? That God works through us to create communities of all people and to spread love and practice in our world? Jacob and Esau are pushed apart by the struggles that were going on in their own family. How can they change the way they cannot change the way they were raised. They can only change the way they look at what happened as they were being raised. One question among many that I work with are people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs, and they say, I don't want to pass this on to the next generation. Do we have questions and issues in our own lives that we need to examine so we don't pass them on to the next generations after us? For many of us, we need to examine the whole issue of white superiority. It's a deep and profound issue that has meant for us and people of color and separated us in many, many different ways. Can we self-examine and think of ways to act differently? But having been implicated, how do we now choose love, realizing that there are barriers between us and others, some that have been constructed by others, some that have been constructed by us? How do we have a Jacob experience to form positive relationships? How do we choose not to hate? How do we now love our neighbor? And in the process, how are we loving God? I want to close with a song that Inshallah sings. I hope I can read it through. It's written by Mark Miller. He's a black composer from the USA South. And this song is responding to the killing of church people in the Carolinas while they were at Bible study. The song is called I Choose Love. Imagine what he had to wrestle with to write this song and what went on in his mind to choose to love a person and people that had partly destroyed his life. In the midst of pain, I choose love. In the midst of pain, falling down like rain, I await the sun again. In the midst of war, I choose peace. In the midst of war, hate, anger, keeping score. War, hate, anger, keeping score. I seek the good once more. I choose peace. When my world falls down, I will rise. When my world falls down, explanations cannot be found. I will climb to holy ground. I choose love. I will rise. In the midst of pain, I choose love. In the midst of pain, sorrow falling down like rain, I await the sun again. I choose love. Amen. May it be so.